Hi everyone, this is a video on Abyss Perfectum, and in this video I'll be reviewing the stages in Abyss Perfectum Stratum 1, and I'll be going through the bosses across all the waves in the fights and what I think is the recommended units to be used in each of these fights. Just a quick disclaimer that this is really just my opinion, and of course, as far as everything else in Dissidia, Final Fantasy Opera Omnia, there are always multiple ways to win chaos stages, and so by no means this is the only way, but I'll be sort of going through the reasons on why I pick particular units for each fight. And really the purpose of this is just to give you guys who may or may not have cleared the stages some ideas on which units would probably give you an easier time for some of these fights. So starting off in Abyss Perfectum Stratum 1, in the main level there are going to be 4 Chaos level 180 fights. And I'll just start off with Stratum Part 3. Now, in the first overview or the first level, the codes required are blue crystal, black crystal, and dagger required units. In Stratum Part 3, there are 2 waves, and the first wave is going to be Heretic Iguions, and the second wave is going to be the Heretic Argent Officiant. Now for this wave, what you really need is a strong dispeller, because the Iguions can have several buffs, and that is actually quite manageable, but the bigger danger in this fight are the Heretic Argent officials who will levitate every now and then, and when they levitate, they cleanse themselves of all debuffs, including frame debuffs, and will grant themselves a range of different buffs. So you can see here in the description that when they levitate, they will remove own buffs, frames included, and they will grant themselves Brave Regen, Brave Damage Resist, and Speed Up to themselves. And this goes along with a very large battery potential, and so with the Brave Damage Resist, it will be quite challenging to shave them down and break them while their buffs are up. So for this reason, you should try to pick units that you have that can dispel and hopefully also add on debuffs as well. So for this fight, what I think would be the best unit to use is overall number 1, Ferris, without a doubt. Now there's a few reasons here, chief of which Ferris herself already meets the requirement for blue crystal as well as a dagger crystal, so just bringing in Ferris will already allow you to meet 2 of the 3 code requirement, and so you only need to round off your party with 1 black crystal character, and you are actually free to choose anyone you want for the third party member. Now Ferris helps a lot because her cannonball actually serves as a dispel and can remove all buffs that the Argent Officiant grants to themselves, and at the same time it also adds on a whole range of debuffs. Now if you don't have Ferris, I would still recommend some other dispeller, anyone that you may have built up already, and examples would maybe be someone like Vanille or maybe even Baltier, who can steal the buffs, although both of these characters don't actually meet the code, and so you do need to round off your party with people who can meet the code requirements. Now, assuming you have Ferris, and you can see here my Ferris actually isn't really built up, she's only at 1 out of 3 EX realization, but that's actually enough for this fight. If you do have Ferris built in, someone else who I think will complement this fight really nicely would be some sort of Gravity Brave Shaver. I use Ultimisia because she has very strong AoE capabilities, and of course her skill 2 is a gravity based shave, which helps a lot in the Argent Officiant fight. But if you don't have Ultimisia built up, some other party members that can be useful include maybe X-Def with his Gravity Brave Shaving, or maybe even Bart's, or anyone else with Gravity Brave Shaving would come in handy here. And for the third crystal character, if you have fairies, really any black crystal character will do, and you can focus someone with strong DPS, because fairies is pretty lackluster in the DPS space. So the next chaos fight that I'll go through is the part 5, which is going to be the Heretic Rafflesia as well as the Osteo Avis fight. Now, this fight I would highly recommend to have some sort of debuff immunity. And there are actually 2 fights here that requires debuff immunity. Stratum part 5 as well as the next fight here in Stratum part 6, because Stratum part 6 actually has a greater Marlboro in it, which everyone knows can inflict a range of very bad debuffs, including blind and poison, through its bad breath attack. So when you plan your party across this Abyss Perfectum, you need to split up your debuff immunity characters or debuff removers across these 2 fights to give yourself an easier time. So for this reason, for Stratum part 5, I chose Afmal for my debuff immunity character, and Afmal can grant your entire party immunity to debuffs, which will help to negate the debuffs that both the Rafflesia and the Osteo Avis can inflict on your party. Unfortunately, Afmal doesn't meet any of the code requirements, which means you do need to round off your party with members who can meet the code. I used Zidane for my blue crystal character as well as the dagger crystal. But you can see here my Zidane really isn't built up. He was actually at base EX when I used him. But because I used Squall as my black crystal character and Squall is pretty strong in the DPS department, that's actually enough to clear the fight. Any other blue dagger crystal character will do here as well. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend Ferris here because Ferris is better used on the earlier fight. But if you have other characters such as H, who is also blue and a dagger crystal character, that can actually work quite well here. H is also quite notable because he can grant your party evasion, which if you don't have debuff immunity characters, you can potentially use H to grant the evasion to avoid some of the debuffs that the bosses can inflict here. But that's going to be a little bit tricky because then you need to time the evasion buff right before the bosses can inflict the debuff. So moving on to Stratum part 6. This fight, as I mentioned, has the Heretic Greater Marlboro as well as the Heretic Sahagin Shamans. Now, if you have debuff immunity, the Great Marlboro is really nothing dangerous to talk about. It's really only risky if you don't have some sort of debuff immunity or ways to mitigate the debuffs that you can cast through bad breath. So for this fight, I used Ignis. And Ignis is also good here because he himself is a dagger character, which meets one of the requirements of the code. And so it just requires you to pick any blue or black crystal character. Ignis is, I guess, an okay support. He can heal, he has some good attack auras. And of course, the most notable thing about him is the debuff immunity that you can grant through his Brave Puff Pastry attack. I think that's what it's called. As long as you have that up all the time, you don't have to worry about the bad breath attack. For the other 2 units, you can really use any other crystal characters in the blue and black tier. I would, however, recommend that if at all possible, you should try to pick blue and black crystal characters that can inflict a range of debuffs or dispel buffs, and that's because the Sahagin Shaman, the notable thing about them is that they have an entire party buff called Supplication for Grace, which grants themselves generic int brave up, attack up, defense up, speed up, and enfeeblement up to themselves, which makes the fight harder than it has to be. So for this reason, I chose Shantoto because she can actually inflict a range of debuffs through her skills. And I rounded it off with Cloud because my Cloud has his Wall of Illusion weapon equipped, which actually allows him to remove one buff each time he deals a critical hit. So that together with Shantoto helps to keep the buffs quite manageable in the Sahagin Shaman fight. So move on to the last bit on this level before I move on to the substratum. So this fight has the Heretic Humbaba as well as the Heretic Merlif Gloria. Now for this fight, what I would recommend if you have it is some sort of tank. And the most notable tank that would meet the code requirements would be Zack, in my opinion, because he's a Black Crystal character. I think Zack is quite good here because both the Humbaba and the Merlif Gloria can hit for quite a significant amount of damage. So having a tank really helps to mitigate the brave damage that's incoming and help to mitigate the danger somewhat. Now for the other two, assuming you have a good tank, good DPS units and a good support is really enough. So I just naturally chose Orania for blue, and then for the dagger, I chose Ram as my dagger character, and my Ram was only at 0 out of 3 EX plus realization. Now if you don't have Zack, you can potentially use Leon as well. And with Leon, you can also mitigate most of the danger here. You can see the only elemental attack the Merlif Gloria has is Firaga, which is really only a brave attack, so it's pretty harmless. And for the Humbabas, they have Tundara and Group Tundara, which would bypass Leon's elemental absorb. But again, those are really only brave attacks, and the dangerous attacks such as Needle Shot and Humbaba Breath are all non-elemental, which would then be converted to Dark Element with Leon's EX and absorbed by your party. So really that's also another option for you. If you really don't have a tank built up, this fight is still quite manageable. But you just have to be a bit more careful, especially with the Merlif Glorias, because they do have some dangerous Brave plus HP attacks which can deal quite a lot of damage without a tank. So if you don't have a tank, at least choose party members who can refund Brave to themselves, as well as support characters who can heal. So good choices here may include people like Makina, who along with being a Black Crystal character and strong DPS, also has a lot of skills that refunds Brave, and this acts as a cushion for the fight. So I'll just move on to the substratum. So for the substratum fight, it's a bit more simpler than the main floor, and that's because you only have 3 chaos fights that you need to split your party towards 2 before you come to the so-called level 185 chaos fight. Now for this, the first time that you enter here, you will have to first clear a stage with the Heretic Cavaliers as well as the Heretic Phantom Male. And for the sub 1 stratum, you actually require a party with blue, green, or white crystal character, and therefore, because you can only fit in a party of 3, you cannot use red, black, or yellow crystal characters here, unfortunately. And along with this, you also need to have a broadsword character for this sub 1 stratum. Now looking at this fight, the most notable about this fight is that almost all the attacks that I can see are actually melee attacks. Uh, in fact, I think that's really all the attacks. Both the Phantom Male and the Cavaliers do not have any magic-based attack, which actually makes Galuf the perfect choice here. He meets the requirement for a green crystal character as well as broadsword, and he helps to mitigate all the attacks they do except for AoE ones, which really isn't that dangerous because their AoE attacks are only brave attacks. So even if they end up breaking your other two characters, they will then only follow this up with a single target HP attack, which will then be dodged by Galuf and counter attacked. So with Galuf here, this fight is pretty much harmless. So you really only need to round off the party with perhaps a good support and a good DPS character. So I chose Rosa and Liz to round off the party. But really, any other support and DPS character will do, considering Galuf makes this fight pretty easy. Once you do that, you unlock the other two Substratum levels. The next one here has the Heretic, Death Machine, and Helldiver in one wave, and then the Guardian on the second wave. Now, if you haven't used Galuf yet, this is potentially another fight that you can use him in because all the attacks here, except for the high pressure water cannon, is actually a melee attack. And in the Ultima weapon, you have this magic attack, so but they are pretty harmless at this point, and Galuf mitigates most of the other attacks here. But of course, if you've used Galuf in the earlier fight, as I mentioned, another very good tank that you can use is Snow. In fact, I think for this fight, Snow is probably better because once his shields are at full stacks, he makes every attack do 0 damage on him, and he can actually taunt all the enemies on wave 1 with his S2. And something that complements Snow very well here would be Lena, who meets the white crystal requirement. Now, if I chose Lena here because if you look at the wave 2 Heretic Guardian, they actually have a Marlboro battle program, which once they turn into Marlboro mode, they spend the first turn doing Tentacle Slap, and their second turn after that is always going to be Bad Breath, which will then inflict debuffs. This will be fully mitigated if you have Lena and her Wind Drake Carol buff up. With Lena and Snow combination, you then only need to find a blue broadsword wielding character. So I chose Cloud, but another good option here would be Vayne as well. Now, if you don't have Lena built up for the debuff immunity, you can then just use any other blue and white crystal character. The Bad Breath attack is quite dangerous, but you can somehow mitigate this if you summon during the Marlboro program and try to burst them down. And in fact, if you do enough damage when they are in the Marlboro phase, you can actually trigger them to change from Marlboro to the Ultima weapon mode, and thereby bypassing the Bad Breath attack. And the last fight here would be the fight on the Magic Halo as well as the Elemental Behemoth. Now for this fight, you really need someone who can enchant and imperil, because if you look at the Elemental Behemoth, they start off resistant to all three physical, range, and magic attacks. So if you have someone who can imperil and enchant a certain element, you can then bypass their resistances. So for this reason, I think Garnet is really the best choice here. She is a green crystal character, and she can enchant and imperil water and lightning, which makes this fight very easy. She also can hit the magic halo when their barriers are up, because when they do their white veil at the start, they are actually weak to lightning, so you can just use her lightning attacks to break through their barrier. And when they cast their black veil, they are actually weak to water, so you can then use her water attacks to break through. And enchanting the entire party with both lightning and water also then makes them able to bypass the barriers that the magic halo creates. So I think by far Garnet is the best choice here. Now if you don't have Garnet, another option would be Fujin, who meets the green crystal requirement. Fujin can imperil wind and enchant wind to the party, which helps to bypass the behemoth on wave 2. On wave 1 though, it's going to be a bit difficult because White Veil will create wind resistance for the magic halo, which will then make the fight a little bit more tricky. And to bypass this, the wind imperil should work. Or another option is perhaps to wait until it's white magic halos over before you enchant wind and imperil wind to the party. But really, Garnet is the best choice here. If you have Garnet, use her for this fight. And coming to the boss fight, so the boss fight you can really use any blue, green, or white. All the restricted characters will be cleared up here, and it's going to be a combination for all. So again, for this fight, you really will need someone who can bypass the resistance here from the elemental behemoth. So again, I would recommend Garnet as one of your party members. If you use Garnet, you can't use Snow or Galuf any longer. So for this reason, I think Warrior of Light will fulfill the white crystal requirement while giving you a tank as well, which will help mitigate the damage from the Phantom Mills. And you can then round off the character with a blue broadsword wielding character, and for that I think Vayne is the best. Okay, so I'll just quickly go on to the last substratum. Okay, so coming to the last substratum. Now this substratum requires red, black, and white crystals, and you need to clear this fight before the others will unlock. Now this fight has the Cray Claw as well as the Coral Assassin, and the character that really stands out here, in my opinion, is Leon, because every attack in this fight across both waves are non-elemental. And with Leon, that means that every attack here will be absorbed. So he really cheeses the fight. My Leon is really only at 0 out of 3, and you can see that is really enough for you to clear. So once you use Leon, you just need to pick any other red or white crystal character who will fulfill the requirement. Secondly, for the next fight, you have the Skull Dragon as well as the Holy Dragon. I think this is actually a pretty straightforward fight. I would recommend some sort of tank, and I used Zack here as my tank, and then I round it off with Sars and Emperor. If you haven't used Leon, Leon is actually usable here as well, because the only elemental attack here is Dark on wave 1, which will be absorbed. And if you use Leon, I believe their Crushing Fang, which is supposed to insta-break you, will actually heal your Brave. For the Holy Dragon, they do have Holy base attacks, but it's only a Brave attack, which is in the Holy and Heavenly Ray. And that's actually quite manageable even with Leon. So if you haven't used Leon, this is another fight that he can come in handy. But overall, I think Zack is more than enough for this fight. and you can then just round off your party with other black, white, and stuff using characters. Now for the third fight here is the Ghost Brothers and the Commander Beast. Now in fact, actually this is also another fight that Leon can really mitigate the incoming Brave damage. But again, I've used him, so I just used the Warrior of Light as my tank. And then for the remainder two, Shantoto comes into play here because she meets the black and stuff crystal character. Really, you can use her in any of the 3 waves, but I would recommend on this wave because the Commander Beast actually can grant buffs to the party. And if you debuff with Shantoto, and in this case I use Emmy the Lion as well, their debuffs combined fill up all the buff slots with frame debuffs, and this helps to prevent them from granting themselves buffs. So coming to the boss fight here, by far and most, since red crystals are a requirement here, I would really recommend using Emmy the Lion for this fight, because she's really broken, and being able to delete turns really helps, especially in the Commander Beast, because by delaying its turn you can prevent it from resummoning its adds once the adds are dead. So that's for the red. And then for black here, you can use either Leon or Zack as your tank. Either would do perfectly fine, and you can then just choose a white crystal character with a staff here. So some good options are like Echo or Emperor, though I wouldn't recommend Emperor with Emmy because the number of frame debuffs are too much with the traps. So the last thing is really only the final level 190 stage on the main level. Once you've completed both substratums, the final stage will unlock. Okay, so coming to the last fight, which is the level 190 fight. I haven't completed this yet because I'm still waiting for Noctis to be released. For this fight, being the blue, black, and dagger crystal requirement, I think the best bet for the black crystal will either be Machina or Noctis, because they have very strong DPS, and that's really required because as you can see over the 4 waves, you have the Argent Offician, the Maraleafs, the Austro Avis, and the Sahagin Shamans. And this is really a very, very long fight because all 4 waves are very tanky, and most people actually finish the fights in around turns 120 to 130. So you really need characters with very good longevity, and that's why I think first of all for Black Crystal, either Machina or Noctis would be a good choice. You can also consider someone like Leon, because Leon will then make everyone into a pseudo tank and help to mitigate some of the brave damage in this fight. For Blue and Crystal, I would recommend someone who can actually meet both the Blue and Dagger crystal requirement. So some options here are like Fairies, who also helps to remove the buffs on the first and the last wave. Although having said that, Faris, you really need her at full 3/3 realization for this fight, because otherwise she wouldn't be very strong in the damage department. Even at full 3/3 she's a bit lacking, but you can then make up for it with your Machina or Noctis. Another good option here would be Zidane, who is also a Blue Dagger crystal character. Zidane has higher damage than Faris, and he helps to be able to launch as well as inflict some debuffs as well, which will help to remove some of the buffs on wave 1 and 4, and that helps somewhat. And lastly, you can consider someone like H, who, although may not be as high a DPS as Zidane, does come in handy with his evasion throughout the 4 waves. Now, the reason why I think combining the blue dagger crystal would be good with the it is really because to round off the party, I would recommend some sort of debuff evasion here, uh, mainly because the Osteo AVs can inflict some debuffs, and for that, Afmal really shines here, not only for the debuff evasion, but because she also has very good longevity, can heal, and does pretty decent in the damage department as well. So most clears I see are with a party of Afmal, Makina, and Zidane or Faris. Um, but I haven't done this fight yet because I don't have any blue dagger crystal characters built up. And I'm sort of waiting for Noctis to be released anyway, so I'll be trying this fight once Noctis is out.